I bought this years ago.
Wow, man. Hold on to
and
that.
and it's even got your autograph in it too.
Where did you find that?
I bought it when it came out.
Did I
And
autograph it for you?
no, okay, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Rainy Cajun podcast. The guest we have tonight is Jason Theriot, Dr. Jason Theriot, who he's got a very special piece of Cajun history to share with us. Jason, thank you for joining us, and then please tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest and how you got involved with all this.
Sure thing, Dave. Jeremy, thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you this. I mean, I grew up in South Louisiana. Like many folks my age, I'm about 50. We kind of took this whole Cajun thing for granted. It was just sort of part of your life. It was everywhere. Yeah, there were guys that had bumper stickers that had the registered coon ass
Yeah,
guys. There were songs, there was music, Cajun country music that would often sing about Cajunness and Cajun lifestyle. But as a young guy, that's just not something that I ever really thought about much. We knew the Raging Cajuns were right down the road, mediocre football team, so to speak. And so this was in the 80s and the 90s. And the Cajun music, which is such a pillar of our culture, for a teenager, getting listening to old country or alternative music, that was just something that the old folks kind of listened to a
yeah.
little bit. And they didn't really teach us that much about it in school.
Hmm.
Surprisingly, I hope that they do now. I've heard that they do. And it's not just at the at the French immersion level, but um, it is a topic, and of course it should be. But I mean, it's just not something that I was very much aware of. I guess I just always figured that we were all kind of Cajuns around here, whoever we were, not really understanding there's a link that goes
Mhm.
back, a few hundred years, and there's a lot of cultural traits connected to it, language, music, obviously, cuisine, being some of the main ones, and then of course being descendants of Acadians, right? And that's just not something that we learn much. I did not have to read Longfellow's poem. The generation before me did.
Yeah.
And of course that was the generation that did not was not taught French by their parents, and their
Mhm.
parents were that World War II generation. So it skipped one, and then
Yep.
obviously it skipped the next.
The World War II was kind of that. That's what my grandparents, I guess, grew up, and your grandparents grew up in that time frame. It was part of the culture. You just took it for granted. You knew that they were from somewhere around there, and there were just certain things that we did. You became interested, or you'd always been interested in World War II.
Theriot grandfather was a an officer in the Pacific, and my mother's grandfather was just a grunt guy, just a seaman. Uh,
Hmm.
but interestingly enough, they now that I think about it, they both told stories that people on their ship referred to them as Frenchy, and I thought, oh, that's kind of neat. I guess, yeah, the whole French connection.
Yeah.
Not knowing that this was a nickname that was given writ large to the Cajuns
Yeah.
who numbered in the tens of thousands.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's kind of how it started for me, was to go and ask my grandfather if I could interview him. In fact, I asked both of my grandfathers if I could interview both of them.
Hmm.
And thinking about the time period, this was 2000. I graduated with a degree in broadcast journalism from LSU. And those guys that was the right time. They were ready to talk then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I was thinking about that. So that was in 2000. Because I went off to graduate school in '91 to Florida State, and I just remember that even though I knew about World War II and my dad had an interest, and my grandfather was, like I said, in the Navy, and I knew about some of the great uncles. It wasn't until they were showing, I remember sitting in my apartment watching, it was the 50th anniversary of all the World War II events, starting with Pearl Harbor in 91, would have been 50 years after. And I remember as the reporters were talking, it might have been Tom Brokaw, they as they're talking about all these events, I'm 22 and I'm listening to the ages of all these guys that are going off and fighting and I realized I'm the same age basically as some of those guys. And in a couple of cases, when they're 18 years old and they're killed, I'm like, wow. I mean, I've had 3 or 4 more years than they've had already.
Jason, what inspired you to dive into this and write the book Frenchie? I mean, what was it? And was it your grandfather's and learning about their story and wanting to know more and diving into that? Or, I mean, because really a book like this doesn't exist to the extent that you've written it. This is something that's truly unique. And I'm just kind of curious, what was it about it or the story of the Frenchies that made you want to write about it?
So I was asked to give a presentation at the Dupre Library at UL on UL campus in 2006. And I recently found the cliff notes to that presentation, and it is titled Frenchie. So I was already developing the concept way back when. And even to go back a little further, I mentioned that I'd interviewed my grandfathers. And the idea was for me to write a little small book, okay, of them and maybe some of their friends, maybe some great uncles or whatever.
Right.
That was in 2001. Fast forward 4 years later, I had interviewed over 100 men and women from Acadiana, not just Iberia Parish where I was from, but gradually word spread. People started actually writing letters to me. We don't write letters anymore. We write emails and text
Yeah.
messages. People were sending letters because they heard that there was a young guy driving around with his grandfather interviewing World War II veterans from the Bayou Teche area. And would you, Mr. Theriot, please come and interview my grandfather? Sure. Yeah, doing radio shows and I think I did Passepartout. In fact, I found that video not too long ago of a way younger me on a very early Saturday morning in November, hunting season. But anyway, I drove around and I interviewed 100 or so veterans with
Wow.
this little gizmo here, this little micro cassette tape recorder. And
Yeah.
then I transcribed those interviews. And then I wrote a 3-volume book series called To Honor Our Veterans, an oral
Yeah.
history of World War II veterans from the Bayou Country. David, you've got one of the last ones. And as I mentioned
Yeah.
earlier, we're conducting a To Honor Our Veterans buyback program. So we'll give you 20% more than what you paid 20 years ago because they're very rare. I only published a few thousand copies, and either we gave them all away or we sold them at little mom and pop bookstores or at the Rotary Club or whatever. So it was fun, and I recorded so many stories and met so many, and no story was the same,
Mhm.
right? But one theme that became consistent was the fact that all of them grew up speaking French, and all of them had to learn English later on in school, whether it was first
Yeah.
grade, second grade, third grade, and this is for all of them. And then gradually, I would run across like maybe one every 20. I would run across one who would say, I had a hard time in school learning English, and the teacher was really mean, and she spanked us because we couldn't, we couldn't speak the language, and that really upset me. And I kind of felt ashamed about that,
Mhm.
about speaking French, and I cried a lot when I was a little kid about it to my parents or whatever. And then lo and behold, here I am asked to be a French interpreter in North Africa in 1943. Like,
Yeah.
wow. Well, gradually you do enough of these interviews, that same story starts ringing true. And it
Mhm.
wasn't just the guy who was who was pulled out of the lines to become an official interpreter on his DD 14 form
Right.
French interpreter. These were just regular Joes, regular GIs who were nicknamed Frenchie and who were able to use their French language
Hmm.
all throughout the French speaking world for the betterment of themselves and for their comrades. Let's say, a squad or a platoon or a company or
Hmm.
a B-17, or a tank, or a group in a tank, or an engineering squad, or a military police group. We're talking thousands of native-born Cajuns who spoke French as their first language ended up in North Africa, France, Europe, Belgium, and places like New Caledonia at 17, 18, 19 years old.
Yeah.
And for the
Wow.
first time, they were told, hey, we need your French. We have
Mm.
to have your French. Frenchie, come over here. There's a French farmer. You need you to interpret. The Germans are somewhere back here. We need you to come talk to them because
Hmm.
the Americans had thought about everything. The one thing they didn't think about was that language gap, the linguistics that are so critical in any kind of
Yeah.
modern military operation. The Americans they didn't have that. They didn't think about that. And
Hmm.
so when they landed ashore in Oran and Casablanca and Tunisia in late 42, 43, that was the first indication that, oh, hey, we've got this large pool
Yeah.
of Louisiana soldiers who are bilingual, and we can pull them and we can put them in headquarters, and we can even have them serve as air traffic controllers to speak to the French pilots coming in. We can have them
Hmm.
as military police. We can have them directing traffic. We can have them, in intelligence, all types of fields. And
Hmm.
boy, when they got to Normandy, right, in June and July of 44, that critical ability to bridge that language gap was
Yeah.
really an asset. And that's when the Frenchies, really, really became not only a popular guy, but really valuable to the military effort.
One of the things you pointed out in one of the interviews I heard, and I think it was from it might have been some of the soldiers, but you talk about when they're doing their training, they come from all over the United States. It's not like these folks were primarily the best. It's not like they went to French class and they made straight A's and after 4 years of college French.
So two quick little examples of that. My grandfather, Harry Jackson, my mother's side, he went to school in New Iberia. Didn't speak a lick of English until he was probably eight years old. Uh, and he told me a story. He said when he was going into the 10th or 11th grade, first got to graduate high school out of his family, by the way. There was a teacher, and this guy was a character too. He says, "Oh, I'm gonna take an easy class. I'm gonna slide in on this A. I'm gonna take French." And the teacher
Mhm.
said, "I guarantee you, you're not gonna pass my French class. You should go take a different elective because his French and the
Mhm.
traditional book taught Parisian French was very different."
Yeah.
Another example of that, Lee Bernard from Erath, Louisiana. I interviewed him a couple of times. He's one of those Frenchies that I connected with late in the game.
Hmm.
Many years later, he recently passed away, probably 2 or 3 years ago, but I had the opportunity to interview him a few times. And one of the stories he liked to tell over and over is that he was busted for speaking French in class, and the teacher made him write on the board 500 times, "I will not speak French on the school grounds." He said, "But I got him. I used two pencils, so I only had to write 250 times." Uh, but so that was, that stigma, that shame of that experience, probably stuck with some people. Some people probably handled it a little bit better. But nonetheless, he
Hmm.
goes off to the military in 1943, 44, and the guys in his unit that he's in basic training with, and then ultimately into tank school, uh,
Hmm.
constantly criticize him, call him a coon ass, and call him all these derogatory names. But as soon as they got in France and they recognized the value that he had and the importance that he had, they
Hmm.
started calling him Frenchie. And so to me, that was almost like that Frenchie nickname was a badge of honor to them.
Hmm.
because they had been discriminated for a good bit of their lives, certainly at school, maybe not at home, but in the larger communities, Lafayette, New Iberia, the bigger cities, maybe not so much out in the country.
Yeah.
Um, those who did go to college, and there were many,
Hmm.
um, there's I'm sure they were discriminated there when they go off to basic training. Just the names of that they were called. I'm sure that was a reminder of that experience growing up, and then
Yeah.
lo and behold, that French language that they were told to forget, became a critical asset.
Yeah, probably trying to not draw attention to themselves, but yet now they got kind of thrusted upon them that it was something good to do.
Prior to World War II, it seemed like the Cajun culture, the way that people outside of Acadiana viewed Cajuns was largely rural and uneducated, and generally speaking, not the sharpest tool in the shed, so to speak. But due to the war and their efforts to do the things that other soldiers could not do, it kind of reinvigorated the culture as a whole, and kind of instigated this a little bit of a renaissance of Cajun culture, and post-war. So as you go into the 60s and 70s, to see this one event in history, in recent history, where they were utilized for their linguistic skills, and then all of a sudden they became a key factor in defeating certain elements of the Axis invasion into France and northern Africa. It's kind of a, like you said, it's like a badge of honor. And do you see in your interviews a kind of a recurring theme with the people that you were interviewing them, how proud they were for what they were able to contribute to the
If you
effort?
ask the right, yeah, if you ask the right questions, and again, for the first 10 years, certainly that first 5 years, that was never a question that came to my mind. I
Mm,
had not made the connection yet. I had not put the pieces together. I tell you
Mhm.
this, that the Cajun culture that we love and adore today, the world around, was not celebrated in the 1920s and 30s. Certainly
right.
not by the Cajun people.
Yeah.
That they would have, in many ways, in many communities, would have been ashamed to have called themselves Cajun or Cajun, right?
Mm-hmm.
La Cajun. Um, and so those, again, growing up, that wasn't that wasn't a focus. My background it wasn't a focus in that first round of interviews.
Right.
But those themes began to gradually eke out, and it took another swing at it in 2006 with a master's thesis, where
Hmm.
now you're in sort of an academic circle,
Right.
and I decided to go to graduate school at the University of Houston, and they force you to go dig into the historiography. Okay, well, what was the view of the Cajun people back at that time? The travel
Yeah.
writers, you got to go read, all the Harper's Weekly and the newspapers and all the books that were being written.
Hmm.
That were, many of these travel writers were very peculiar about these Cajun people.
Right.
Um, but so I did that. I dug in deep, and here's one copy of two. The first copy ended up at the library, and here's the other one. And the date on it is 2007, and the title is Cajuns in World War II. So this was my first real opportunity to kind of take a swing at the intellectual argument or the intellectual concept of Frenchie.
Yeah.
And so that was my first dive into that. I got a hold of some primary source letters from two really interesting collections. And that really helped shape this idea in my mind that in 2007, as I was only really starting to toy with that something unique happened to this group.
Hmm.
100%, it had to happen. It didn't happen to every Cajun that went into World War II, but those who were placed in French-speaking communities, something happened to them. What was it? And so I'll read some of the primary letters, and you'll get a sense real quick for what I'm talking about. Remember,
Sure.
there was no Cajun pride.
Yeah.
They didn't use the word Cajun. They didn't even write the word Cajun.
Mm-hmm.
This is from the Joel Fletcher papers at UL. Joel Fletcher was the president of SLI, which became USL, now UL. Several
Mm-hmm.
Cajuns did ultimately either take a class or graduate from UL, and they were sending letters back to him, and he was putting them in a newsletter and sending them overseas to many of the young men and women who were either alumni or were associated. This is from Thomas Theriot, okay? France, October 44. As an ordnance liaison officer, I have been able to see much of France, and my Cajun, in quotation marks, French has been very handy. In fact, my French is more correct than most of the dialects I heard in Normandy and Brittany. So he not only capitalizes the word Cajun, but he puts it in quotation marks. So, okay, a one-off. No, guys, there's dozens, hundreds of examples from letters written from World War II, Cajun GIs, airmen, Marines, even some females that I've been able to, ladies who were Cajun ladies, in multiple places, including in local newspapers like the Abbeville newspaper, Crowley St. Martinville newspaper. About 15 years ago, companies started digitizing these local newspapers, and now you can purchase a subscription and you can go and keyword search whatever you want. And it's direct hits. So I uncovered, 100 or so actual letters that the families of these servicemen and women were sending to the local newspaper to say, here's a report from my son. Here he is. He's in France. And it'll say something like, here I am, guys. You wouldn't believe it, but I'm so proud to be able to speak French and to be a Cajun here in Louisiana. And I interpret for the boys in my unit, and I'm getting along great. And I'm starting to meet girls, and I'm been spending weekends at this French family, and life is great. It's such a complete, sort of 180 from what you might have thought life in the military at 18 years old in France. In an armored unit running across France, or stuck in a foxhole for weeks at a time, or, whatever. So, I mean, these guys had a different experience, and that experience changed them about who they are and about their culture. And it made them recognize, I think, for the first time, that there was a distinctive culture that they were very proud of.
A lot of cases, and examples you gave, they were used as translators. But a lot of times, I think you even emphasize the fact that they were not always designated as a translator, but they were pressed into service as a translator.
Yeah, so there's two examples of that. One is a guy by the name of Bernice Lejeune. He was from Church Point, one of the early guys that I interviewed, so probably 2002 or 3. Again, I didn't know anything about him when I went to his house and sat there in his living room with he and his sweet little wife. And Bernice Lejeune said that when he went to the recruiting station to join the military, they asked him, they said, okay, well, how many languages do you speak? And he said, oh, I speak 2. And they said, okay, well, what's the other language? And he said, French. And this is what he told me. He said, and he remembered this, and he told me this again another time. So it's one of those things that stick in their mind, right? He said, he looked at his name and he heard his accent, and he said, oh, sorry, young man, but the military doesn't have use for that kind of French. This is a guy who ended up in North Africa in an anti-aircraft unit and was called on to come settle a dispute between some American and some French troops, because, there was a lot of French troops who were in North Africa at that time. And he got pegged to be an interpreter for a colonel in a Jeep for the next 2 years. And they drove all the way to Tunisia, crossed the Mediterranean, ended up in Italy. ended up in southern France, driving this colonel around. Um,
Wow.
and then you had a guy like Orleans Pete. Orleans Pete went to LSU. So Orleans was from Cut Off, Louisiana. You know where that's down the bottom.
Yep.
All
Yeah.
right, down by Lafourche. He graduated from LSU, and LSU was a military and engineering college. Back
Hmm.
in the day. So everybody joined the ROTC, and he majored in education and French, and he became a French teacher. He was teaching French at Golden Meadow High School in 1943 when the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS,
Hmm.
predecessor to Central Intelligence Agency, of which your great uncle
Yeah.
Sanji ended up being recruited for as well. The OSS
Hmm.
came knocking. Hello, can we meet with Mr. Pete for a moment at recess? Mr. Pete, we realize that you've got some skill sets that we need, and we'd like to see if you'd be interested in volunteering for special missions. And so he went with so many others like Bob LeBlanc and Sam Broussard and Roy Armentar and Shirley Ray Trumps and Claude Galley. And, I could go on and on. There were dozens.
Hmm.
That first batch that I mentioned were those who I was able to interview before they passed
Yeah.
away during the course of all this. So they all go to Camp David in late 43. They're training with British Special Forces commandos. They're training in with French legionnaires. They're trained
Hmm.
in all types of ammunition, demolition and weapons and all these clandestine techniques on how to sneak into places and how to not get caught and break into safes and locked
Hmm.
rooms and all this. Um, how to handle your business without weapons, that kind of thing. And these
Hmm.
guys were deployed into France as special forces, either detachments where they led, small little jeep squads behind enemy lines to rendezvous with the French resistance, or they parachuted in.
Yeah.
Okay, many of them did, and one of them was Orleans Pete. So he was involved because he was older, kind of like Sanji was older.
Yeah. Yeah.
Orleans was involved in. He was the assistant. He was the deputy chief trainer once they got into England. So he was really involved in some nitty gritty training, and he actually jumped out of an airplane with 14 French female resistance fighters into the northeast corner of Paris in September.
Wow. Dang.
And that wasn't the only jump he made. So I mean, here's just a regular Joe teaching French at
Yeah.
22, 3 years old at his local high school, and a year later he's jumping out of an airplane over France with people that could speak his language. So they were well-rounded. They were
Hmm.
able to handle themselves in so many different situations. And yes, there were particular positions and roles that they could fill. But then there was the average everyday Frenchie who was called upon to go find things like eggs, milk, cheese, fresh meat. Ooh, what about the
Hmm.
booze? Very
Yeah.
important. The Calvados, the wine, the champagne. Frenchie could go and talk to the farmer and negotiate and barter with him for chocolate or Lucky Strikes or whatever. And
Yeah.
he'd bring back the booze back to his buddies. And then the Frenchman would say, "Hey, Frenchie, come spend the weekend with me. And this is my daughter. She's 18 years old." And next thing you know, Frenchie meets the guy's daughter. And a year later, he brings her back home somewhere to South Louisiana. He's got a French war bride. So Frenchie
Yeah.
had a real unique experience. Not, that not like many other American GIs had.
Could you get what, 200 or so interviews that you've captured?
I
Um,
think we're nearing that. Yes, certainly after
yeah.
this last batch. Like I said, I probably interviewed 10 over the last 3 or 4 years. Of those 10, only three are still living.
Hmm.
There's probably a few more, scattered out, maybe in retirement communities. Maybe their health isn't as good.
Yeah.
And then another 40 or 50 for that master's thesis. And then, 100 plus or whatever for that first round. And then the other
Yeah.
thing too, guys, is that people were finding cassette tapes, VHS tapes, memoirs, old envelopes full of stuff,
Uh-huh.
diaries, and they were mailing it to me. So
Wow.
this is an interview with a guy named Charles Ducote from up in Marksville, whose daughter interviewed him. And it's a very short interview. It's about 15 minutes, and it's taken from the kitchen table. But this fellow Charles Ducote, who died 20 plus years ago, he told a story of arriving on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and the
Hmm.
commander in the field called him Frenchie to come up to the front lines to come and interpret with this local French farmer, because the French farmer was trying to communicate that there is a hidden German pillbox over here. And the guy Ducote, just the way that he was a storyteller, because all these folks are just great storytellers.
Yeah.
He explained it in French, and then he translated into English exactly how he communicated to this Frenchman. And I'll paraphrase it. It said, I, I don't speak the French words that he was saying, but basically in English, he said, over there, behind these trees is a camouflage bunker. Behind
Hmm.
some vines, there's a wooden door. In there are 25 Germans, and that's where you need to go. And so he was able to communicate that to his people. And so it's stories like that that I've also been able to gather over the years that are included in the Frenchy book, because it wasn't just me.
Right.
It was many of these family members who over time just wanted to reach out to somebody who was collecting all this material. And in fact, I got a phone call today from a Benoit guy who heard there was an interview with me on WWNO, and he just wanted to call and reconnect
Yeah.
and and talk about it. And so there's dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of families have contacted me over the years with stories, whether they're secondhand stories that can or cannot be corroborated. Those that were
Right.
corroborated were put in the book. But
Hmm.
not every story can go in the book, and not every story can be
Oh yeah.
corroborated. But certainly people who had cassette tapes with interviews and diaries and letters, so many letters
Yeah.
from that time period. Those are all golden nuggets to find. And this
Hmm.
Frenchie project that came out, in the book with UL Press, Frenchie, the story of the French speaking Cajuns of World War II. That's sort of a compilation of all this over
Hmm.
25 years, with, sort of my twist, my interpretation on
Yeah.
what it meant for these Cajuns in recognizing their Cajun identity for the first time.
If I'm correct, isn't that available online? The actual, you can hear the actual digitized versions now through one of the websites.
So let's see, the Center for Louisiana Studies houses the Jason Theriot Oral History Collection. And so all of these little tapes, those little cassette tapes, and there were hundreds of those little rascals, and that was the worst thing to use. But nonetheless, we may only lost one or two of them to deterioration and whatnot. But a guy by the name of Chris Segura, who's the archivist there at the center, he's been there for quite a while. There's a really good team over there, and they do this as a service, as a paid service. They will restore your material, and then they'll archive it, especially dealing with audio, since there's such a focus on Cajun music and Zydeco
Hmm.
music and oral history collections there at the center.
Yeah.
So I donated all of that years ago, and they've digitized it once, and new technology comes out, and they'll digitize it again. And so all of that material it's technically available on their server.
Okay.
It's just the access to it. We're not quite there yet where you can go to a website and say, "Oh, I want to look up my
Hmm.
grandfather." But eventually, that would be the idea.
Hmm.
And for me, if anybody out there knows any World War II veterans who were interviewed by me or may have been, and you
Hmm.
want to see if they're there, just send me an email, go to jasonterrio.com and send me the name. And if they were interviewed, then we can go look that up and easily get you
Yeah.
the wave file.
Did you find that when some of the more modern films came out that were much more raw about like D-Day, Saving Private Ryan comes to mind almost immediately, that, the whole storming the beach scene, the opening scene. Did you find that there was a renewed interest in learning more about what happened on not only just D-Day, but just in general in the European theater and the North African theater? Did you get a sense that the people that you were talking to were wanting to talk more about that, or talk to those kinds of portrayals of what happened?
There were definitely some who got emotional in telling their stories. Ed Broussard, for one. In fact, he's on the front cover of the book. He's right there. He was in the Louisiana National Guard. He became he entered officer candidate school out of the Guard, and then ended up in France leading a platoon, and was received a Purple Heart and a Silver Star for heroics in action. He was at the Battle of the Bulge. But I mean, I can remember sitting at his little kitchen table, and he was just breaking down. And there you are with a 85, 82, 83, 84-year-old five guy, and he's spilling his guts out, probably for the first time about it. There was another guy by the name of, I believe it was Dudley Duyon from Erath. And quiet guy, didn't say much on the phone. When I'd call him on the phone, I'd try to get a little bit of information so I could I could research it on my way there. And when I went to interview him, it's almost as if he had a complete prepared script in his head, because he looked down at his feet and just rattled off a story for an hour and a half without skipping a beat. And it's like, wow, you haven't talked about this to many people, have you, sir? And so, and then he dies like 2 or 3 months later. So yeah, I mean, I got a whole wave. Some of them, like Carol Metier, who I interviewed a couple of times, had a completely a different view so many years later from his horrific experience at Easy Red Sector, Omaha Beach in the first wave, 7:30 a.m. On D-Day, because he saw his best friend killed, Houston Duyon, who was from New Iberia, and Carol was from Lorville, and he drug his friend's lifeless body to the beach, and try to duck and hide, and he said this over and over a couple of times. He said, well, he was trying to reminisce. He would say, "Carol, what are you doing here? You dumbass. Why are you here? You're gonna get killed. What are you doing here?" And he would say, "I was just a poor kunas from Lorville. I didn't know nothing, and here I am, with my friend getting shot." So, and then he would quickly shift to the time that he moseyed into a little barber shop somewhere in France and sat down to have a haircut with all these older guys, and he was speaking French to them, and the barber's name was Raoul Metier. And Carol said, "Are you kidding me? My dad's name is Raoul Metier." So many of them would prefer to tell those kind of funny, fun-loving, happier stories, and sort of avoid, avoid some of the, the more terrible ones, the foxhole stories from Battle of the Bulge, or you living in those nasty nasty jungles, or being wounded. Many of them were wounded and ended up in hospitals. Some were wounded and ended up in prisoner hospitals.
Yeah.
Okay. And it was just, something that they had to go through. But, I do think that I was at the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Early 2000s.
Definitely.
They were ready to talk. They were ready to talk then. Saving Private Ryan had come out. A less interesting movie called Pearl Harbor, a love triangle had come out. 3 hours, way too, way too long.
It's kind of
You had
like
the
the
museum.
Titanic of World War II
Yes.
movies. It's like it doesn't
You
make
you
sense.
had the
Sorry.
Band of Brothers right around the corner with the
Yeah,
book, and then with the
Yeah.
HBO series,
yeah, yeah.
you had the 40th anniversary, the 50th anniversary. So things were starting to stack up, and they were ready to talk. They had grandkids that were like me,
Hmm.
15, 16, 17 years old,
Right.
coming to them and asking them, could you tell me your story from my history class? So they were starting to
Yeah.
open up, and it was just for me, I was just very lucky to have met so many of them when I
Yeah.
did. And now here we are 25 years later, and literally, guys, there's only three of that
Hmm.
entire group that I have gotten to know that I'm still in contact with, and was able to have some last curtain calls with them here in the last couple of months at some events in their
Yeah.
hometowns.
Yeah.
Norris Morvaunt in Thibodeau, who was an interpreter in General Eisenhower's headquarters. Fascinating story. He's 100. Shirley Guidry in Jennings, who was in an engineering battalion and spoke to French people all throughout his time in France. And then Pridgeon Fontenot, who's in Crowley, who showed up in France early 45, actually did some interpreting as well in the I think it was the 90th Infantry Division. So that's it, man. All we've got is their stories and
Yeah.
their memories from their families, and part of all this was to capture all that and pay one last tribute to that great generation before the last of the storytellers are gone.
You may not get the complete story, but you can find out because you told us the estimates in some of your other podcasts. What, over 10,000 maybe South Louisiana uh, soldiers, French soldiers. They weren't all maybe considered Frenchies, but I mean it was a great number. So somewhere you probably have a great uncle or a
Yeah.
grandfather that served and or had similar stories to this. So you may just have to go out and seek it and find out what you can find, and you may not get the gold nuggets like you found, but there's still maybe a lot of things out there worth looking for.
Yeah, we discovered a collection at the Gaydon Museum. No, it was the Kaplan Museum. So right outside of Gaydon, just this little bitty small museum, wildlife museum.
Hmm.
The duck capital of the world down there.
Yeah.
This lady called me and she says, I've got a bunch of boxes of tapes from high school students that interviewed World War II veterans over 20 years. I'm
Wow.
on my way. And there were 650, we think, at least, might be more. Some of it were
Wow.
unlabeled. 650 tapes of different medium that high school students had recorded interviews with World War II veterans and elders, their grandparents,
Hmm.
from the mid 1990s until the 2010s. So, or, early 2000s, over a 20-year period. So,
Wow.
wow. Does anybody know this?
Yeah.
There were a few hundred letters that we discovered handwritten at Nichols that somebody had collected and made a scrapbook. I don't I still don't remember who the collection belongs to,
Hmm.
but there's a few hundred letters there. I mean, you can you can dig into this stuff forever. There's
Yeah.
always going to be that long lost diary. There's always going to be um, that one story that's out there lingering. And some people are lucky enough to have a VHS tape. I've had
Yeah.
someone send me VHS tapes before. So, and in the digital age, it's a little bit easier now, more efficient, I should say, to track down information. But every unit that participated in World
Yeah.
War II has its own unit history.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, there may not be any, veterans still associated with it, but there are all these unit histories.
Hmm.
Um, so there's plenty out there for those family members.
Hmm.
There's the Department of Veterans Affairs. I mean, they can dig to their discharge papers
Hmm.
using social security number and old addresses to find the little bits of information that's out there. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so I've got a big warehouse here in that back closet, guys, that's full of stuff like that. And eventually I'm going to box it off and go dump it in the on the patio of the Center for Louisiana Studies
Yeah.
so that others down the road can have access it to.
I realize that you're cultivating a bunch of stories, but you have identified as something that is truly unique and special. And I think that this is something that every person who has any kind of historical roots in Louisiana, but anybody who is interested also in what happened, those stories you never hear about World War II. This is important history. These are things that people should know, even if it's cursory knowledge. But but absolutely, if you have any kind of Cajun descent, any kind of Cajun lineage, you should know what they're responsible for, and bringing in an element to the war effort that it largely has gone unsung. But you've made it, your mission to make people aware of this, and I commend you for that, because I know there's a lot of work. I've written books just like you have, and to be able to get all these references, all these sources, and turn it into something that essentially what's working out to be a historical document, a compilation of everything that's happened during that time, and then what's happened since then too. Then for those people who don't have a sense of pride, maybe the with the way things happened in the 70s and 80s, where people began associating Cajuns with just food and the spicy food and the heat and all this other stuff, that that's an element of it, but it's not, doesn't define the Cajun people. It doesn't define. It's a group of people that have seen a lot of struggles in their history as a group, and for you to document that, and it's kind of paying homage to that. So I commend you for that. I thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah,
We appreciate it.
One step further is if you think about after the war, right? So for the first time, many of these Cajuns were able to go to college on the GI Bill. They were able to afford a house through the GI Bill loan. My grandfather took up flying with his GI Bill. He had already been working since he was 14 years old, so he didn't think he needed to go to college. But just think about the post-war era of prosperity.
Sure.
So many returning Cajuns ended up in the oil and gas business. So many of them worked 30 plus years for an oil company, whether it be Texaco or Gulf or Mobil or Sun or Tenneco or whatever. That was the generation that created this this incredible oil and gas offshore industry. These were the folks who were the boat operators. They weren't just the operators, but they built companies. They created, important widgets and service companies that were so important. There's a whole story there. There's a whole legacy there of your listeners who had, family who were involved in that industry. If you look at down your way, they with the sugar cane, with the cattle ranching down in Vacherie and whatnot. I mean, that's a whole nother story of the role that World War II veterans played in industry and in communities post-war, right? Because we're not only beneficiaries of what they did as servicemen and women, but we're certainly beneficiaries of the communities and the local economies that they built through their civic leadership, through their volunteer time, just by running companies and hiring people and raising families. So to me, that's sort of the next phase of all this for me is what they did after the war and how we're all still benefiting from that dedication, from that experience of that generation. And there's a museum of every kind of industry and every kind of little community.
Yeah.
So if your listeners out there have a dad or a granddad who did one of these, miraculous things of creating a
Hmm.
business or creating a new technology or whatever, I'm sure there's a museum in that little community that would love to have a bit of that
Yeah.
history to display for tourists or for the locals,
Yeah.
or
Hmm.
to educate the public now and into the future.
I agree.
Then you better get to writing, buddy. You got a lot of ground to cover. I mean, you got a couple of decades to go after now.
Yeah. So, I mean, the underlying theme, kind of like we've talked about a couple of cookbooks that are almost like family memoirs and recipes and family albums. And they don't have to be all fancy published, but everybody's family's got stories. And, to do kind of the stuff like you can do go to the extent like Jason has, or you can just try to find it in your family, and let your general family know about it. And, if it's worth, they're more than likely, like I said, it's going to be an interesting story that your friends may want to hear, and take pride in your Cajun ancestry and what these folks did, and learn from it and pay homage to them by going out and being a good steward of the world and all that. So I
And
don't
all
want to get
you
too
really
preachy.
need is one of
Uh,
these and
yeah,
a little tripod
Yep.
and a
yeah,
little instruction to your 15-year-old, kid and 18-year-old kid and say, hey, go interview your great uncle. Go spend an
yeah,
hour with them and turn on the recorder and just let them talk. And
Yep.
then you've got that documented. That's what I do. I don't
oh
use a
yeah,
fancy camera. I use a fancy phone, right? I mean, they cost about the
yeah,
same anyway. But
yeah,
I've been doing life story videos with people, just basic general people. I interviewed a 85-year-old grandmother the other day simply just because she had such a wealth of knowledge that her family
hmm,
wanted to capture for them and for the next generation. So anybody can do that. You just need to go visit those old people.
That's right.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Am I right to see here that the current edition was just published at the beginning of September?
yes, yeah. The
Okay.
the book, the Frenchie book,
Yeah.
came out in September, so it's been out for a couple of months already.
Okay.
And I've done a couple of 3 or 4 book signings, and they've been well received. And like I said, especially bringing those World War II veterans with me, those Frenchy veterans, that's been
Hmm.
really cool to kind of come full circle,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah,
and hand them the microphone and have them tell
yeah,
stories and
Yeah.
receive them.
yeah. That's
So
priceless, Jason. We may just have to have you back in the future to talk about some other stuff. 'Cause like I said, it's hard to sometimes contain it just when Jeremy and I are talking for an hour, and then getting on a subject, because I keep thinking of more questions to ask, but at the same time it's
Yeah.
like, man, we'd be up here till 2 in the
Yeah.
morning, and I think
Getting us to
or
talk is not the problem. Getting us to shut up is the problem. That's
yeah, yeah.
so
But anyway, we appreciate it, and I get
Yeah.
Jeremy, you'll put everything in the show notes and all.
yes,
Show
I
notes
will.
about it.
For those of you that are watching, be sure to like and subscribe, just because if you are watching and we do have Jason back and you found the content interesting, you'll know when he's back on the show. What platforms are your podcast episodes available on?
it's on all of the major ones.
Okay.
It lives at jasonterrio.com. So I have a web page there just specifically for it, so that I can, control it and update it as need be. And then, you can get it on all the podcasting platforms out there. And the most recent one that launched on Veterans Day is a replay of my presentation at the Roy House for when the book launched. But there's a special little twist in there because we had Shirley Guidry there raising an American flag at the Roy House for the first time with assistance from my 13-year-old son. So I brought
Yeah.
my son on the podcast show to come get his, 15 seconds of fame. And I'm wondering if that new little girlfriend he's got over there in 8th grade was influenced by hearing his young manly voice on the radio. Not too many 13-year-old boys can get on a history podcast. So I told
That's
him, I said,
right.
hey
That's
man,
true.
You need some extra credit from your history teacher for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Jason, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And
Enjoyed the time.
Well, we did as well. And
yes.
we'll catch everybody on the next episode. Thanks a lot for joining us.